Hello and welcome to Monday in Parliament. Our look at the best of the day in the Commons and the Lords. On this programme, don't try and overturn the outcome of the EU referendum. The message to MPs from the Brexit Secretary, David Davis.
These are not constructive proposals to enable Britain to make a success of Brexit. I'm sorry, they look increasingly like attempts to thwart and reverse a decision that was taken on June 23rd.
The battle against Daesh terrorists moves to the Syrian city of Raqqa.
Daesh has used the city as its headquarters to plot attacks against British citizens, and it is vital that this evil organisation is routed for good.
And we've heard of education czars and health czars. Is it time to have one more?
Has the government thought of the possibility of appointing one of them as a knotweed czar to get rid of all?
But first, the enemies of the people. The strong and controversial headline used by one tabloid newspaper to describe the three senior judges, members of the High Court, who ruled last week that the approval of Parliament, not the Prime Minister alone, was needed to trigger the process for Britain to leave the EU. It was a victory for a group of pro-Parliament campaigners who dared to mount a legal challenge to the government. Reaction to the ruling has been plentiful, were the interests of the people, expressed in the June referendum, being sidelined, had the government's approach to Brexit been dealt a serious blow. 4 days after the High Court verdict, the Brexit Secretary came to the Commons.
With permission, Mr. Speaker, I would like to make a statement to the House on the process for invoking Article 50. We've always been of the clear view this is a matter for the government, that it's constitutionally proper and lawful to give effect to the referendum result by the use of prerogative powers. As I have said, the basis on which the referendum was held was the government would give effect to the result of that referendum. That was the basis on which people were asked to vote.
He said the High Court judges had taken a different view.
The government disagrees with the court's judgment. The country voted to leave the European Union in a referendum approved by an Act of Parliament. Our position remains that the only means of leaving is through the procedure set out in Article 50, and that triggering Article 50 is properly a matter for the government using its prerogative powers. We will appeal, as a result, the High Court's judgment at the Supreme Court. Now, given our appeal, it would not be appropriate to comment further on the details of the legal arguments, and I'm sure the House will understand this. We're going to get on with delivering on the mandate to leave the European Union the best possible way for the UK's national interest, best for jobs, best for growth, and best for investment.
Keir Starmer.
This is the third statement he's made to the House in just a few months. Nobody could accuse him of not being willing to turn up to the dispatch box. It's just that each time he does so, we leave none the wiser about the government's basic approach to negotiation. There is a mandate to leave, and we will not frustrate the process by voting down Article 50. But we cannot have a debate in a vacuum. Yep. The future relationship of the UK with our EU partners is at stake. The future relationship of the UK in the world is at stake. The Prime Minister simply cannot keep all of this to herself. Yep. The government needs to act in the national interest, to build a consensus, to act not for the 52%, but for the 52% and the 48%, to put the country first.
He turned to Friday's press headlines, condemning the judges as enemies of the people.
Robust comment on and criticism of court judgments is right in a country that respects free speech. But we all have a duty to stand up for the rule of law and the independence of the judiciary. The Lord Chancellor has a special duty to do so. Mr. Speaker, the Lord Chancellor has a special duty to do so because by convention judges do not engage in public debate and are thus unable to defend themselves. Yet the Lord Chancellor has been too slow and too reluctant to do her duty.
The Brexit Secretary quoted what some Labour and Lib Dem MPs had been saying.
The Honourable Member Pontypridd suggests that Labour would amend any Article 50 bill to bring about a second referendum. And the Right Honourable Member for Sheffield Hallam, who's here, the former Deputy Prime Minister, suggested after last week's result that his party would seek to amend any legislation on triggering Article 50 to allow for a second referendum on our new relationship with the European Union. He didn't like the first answer given by the voters, so he seeks to put the question all over again in the hope of a different answer. These are not constructive proposals to enable Britain to make a success of Brexit. I'm sorry, they look increasingly like attempts to thwart and reverse a decision that was taken on June 23rd.
Does he agree, and has he told his boss, the Prime Minister, that we could have saved this government, its lawyers, ministers and High Court judges a lot of time and effort had Parliament approved his parliamentary control of the executive bill that he brought before the House on the 22nd of June 1999 that would have clearly restricted the use of the Crown prerogative until assent of the House of Commons had first been obtained, including to exercise executive powers not conferred by statute, Mr. Speaker.
The government has at various times in the last few months said it wanted to unify the country, heal our divisions and build a national consensus. And that is something that we should all, on every side of this House, leave and remain, want to see. But can I say to the Secretary of State, how is it remotely possible to build that national consensus unless the government is far more transparent with the country and this House of Commons about its plan for the Brexit negotiation?
Can you explain to the House why an approach involving Parliament's prerogatives of scrutiny is appropriate for amendments to EU treaties, but not appropriate to the much larger endeavour of pulling the United Kingdom out of the EU altogether?
And the fact that 17.4 million people, a majority of the British people, voted for our national independence is a precious thing, and that must be respected. So will my right honourable friend guarantee to me that he will not allow the efforts by the right honourable members for Sheffield, Hallam, Doncaster North, or indeed any member of the other place, to thwart the mandate that this government has been given in order to ensure that we can take back control of our laws, our money, our trade and our sovereignty?
It's important for our reputation after we have left the European Union that all of us speak up for the independence of the judiciary and, above all, do not regard freedom of expression in the press as any excuse for personal, abusive and frankly disgraceful innuendo being raised against individual members of her judges' judiciary.
Does my right honourable friend agree that rather than trying to tie the hands of the Prime Minister, members of both houses of this Parliament should put the national interest first, let the Prime Minister get on with the job of getting the best deal for Britain?
Without greater transparency, how can the government provide that reassurance that they're not just representing 52% or 48%, but the whole of the country?
If the Supreme Court doesn't overturn the perverse decision of the High Court, does my right honourable friend expect the Labour Party to agree to trigger in Article 50 without any conditions? And given it was made perfectly clear in the Conservative Party manifesto at the last election that we would have a referendum and we will honour the result of the referendum, whatever the outcome, does he expect the House of Lords to honour the conventions of this place, that it wouldn't stand in the way of that manifesto promise?
Well, I'm responsible for many things, but the Labour Party stance is not one of them, which is frankly just as well, given they've had three of them over the weekend, three different stances.
The reaction in the Commons to last week's High Court judgment. There was also no shortage of reaction over in the Lords.
We all believe in the freedom of the press, and we all believe in the independence of the judiciary. But I doubt very much if there's a single one of your noble lordships who doesn't believe in the supremacy of Parliament and the sovereignty of Parliament. The decision made by the High Court judges underlines and indeed ensures the application of that doctrine. Why is it that nowhere in the four corners of this statement is there any reference to the sovereignty of Parliament?
The government at no stage has said, first of all, that they accept that the three judges acted in accordance with their judicial oath, and secondly, nobody on behalf of the government has separated themselves from the remarks of Mr. Sajid Javid when he described the three judges as, quote, thwarting the will of the people.
The statement seems to imply that the referendum made a decision to leave the European Union. my lords, those of us who served on the bill setting up the referendum know that that is not so. It was clearly an advisory referendum. And it is therefore, I think, very important the government shouldn't now treat it as a mandatory referendum, which would in fact be contrary to our and incompatible with our system of representative parliamentary democracy.
Why can't the government just give us a really detailed green paper outlining and analysing all the complexities of the situation, nothing to do with the negotiation and the position, that comes quite separately, and then we can debate that over, say, 2 or even 3 days and give the best input of Parliament from both houses of Parliament, and then bring forward a one-clause bill authorising the Article 50 process to go forward. Isn't that a simpler and more constructive way of proceeding than the one we're on now?
Well, I hear what my noble friend has to say, but the Prime Minister has made it clear that we are going to appeal this judgment.
An American-backed Kurdish and Arab force has begun an operation to capture the Syrian city of Raqqa, a stronghold of the so-called Islamic State terror group, often referred to in the Commons as Daesh. The coalition of Kurdish and ethnic Arab militias has been gaining ground in areas to the north of the city. A spokesman was quoted as saying, "A major battle to liberate Raqqa has begun." The topic was raised at Defence Question Time in the House of Commons.
Reports over the weekend suggest that the deployment and moves into Raqqa are imminent. Can you give us any update on what's going to happen and what support we will be providing to the efforts against Daesh in Raqqa?
Well, yes, I can tell the House that we expect operations to first isolate, and then encircle and then liberate Raqqa are beginning shortly. And our forces, our Royal Air Force, will be involved in a similar role there in providing intelligence and reconnaissance from the air, but close air support to troops on the ground as well.
Mr. Speaker, we support the RAF's involvement in the campaign to liberate Raqqa. Daesh has used the city as its headquarters to plot attacks against British citizens, and it is vital that this evil organisation is routed for good. Before launching the operation to free Mosul, the Iraqi government made careful plans about exactly which groups would be allowed to enter the city to avoid the real risk of sectarian violence. Can the Secretary of State tell us whether similar plans have been made in respect of Raqqa?
Raqqa is predominantly an Arab city, and it is the coalition's view that its encirclement and liberation should be accomplished by a predominantly Arab force.
I recently met with the Iraqi ambassador, and he reiterated the need to defend the border between Iraq and Syria to ensure that Daesh cannot return to re-establish itself in Mosul or anywhere else. Can the Secretary of State set out what role the UK will play in securing the border and defending the territorial integrity of Iraq?
Well, I'm grateful to the Honourable Lady. Yes, it is not for us in the West to question the territorial integrity of Iraq. It is for the Iraqi people to decide in the end their borders. And one of the aims of the Counter-Daesh Coalition, which I shall be chairing at its next meeting next month in London, one of the aims is to see what can be done after the liberation of Mosul and after the final mopping up operations along the Tigris and in the Euphrates River Valley, to see what more can be done by the coalition countries to help Iraq reinforce its border and ensure that the Daesh doesn't come back through.
Sir Michael Fallon. You're watching our roundup of the day in the Commons and the Lords. Still to come, a growing problem in every sense. What to do about knotweed. Home Office officials have been telling MPs about the challenges of resettling Syrians who are fleeing the civil war. The government has promised to give refuge to 20,000 Syrians by May 2020. A report by the National Audit Office concluded that the programme will need to speed up to meet that pledge. It's also estimated that the total cost of supporting vulnerable Syrians could be £1.7 billion. The Public Accounts Committee is investigating how public money is being spent.
Clearly, you're achieving some success in bringing people in, but I'm interested in what happens to your monitoring and evaluation. I mean, that seems to be the challenging aspect of this exercise, or a particularly challenging aspect. So you've given a number of criteria in terms of what you will be monitoring. But I'm afraid I think they seem quite vague to me.
We've been very clear from the outset that success in this scheme is not simply about moving 20,000 people from one location to another, but actually the outcomes that you describe are precisely those we want to achieve and monitor. What we've therefore done from the outset is to define the areas that you describe around English language progression, entry into the labour market. And we've built the programme right from the outset with the capacity to monitor those things so that we're not having to come to that later in the day and start trying to retrofit an evaluation.
When I hear monitoring and evaluation, I think of targets, I think of sort of hurdles, numbers, that sort of thing. Whereas these criteria seem very soft. I mean, broadly, how will you judge yourselves, over the next 5 years?
Well, I think I don't think soft is quite the right word, because of course we are dealing here. We aren't delivering a thing. We're dealing with people, and we're dealing with people, and we're dealing with people, and
I'm not saying they're not challenging, but I think it's quite hard.
No, I do understand.
We like measurable.
I do understand.
Yes.
No, I do understand the point. It's just, I think it is just, we do need to remember the complexity of dealing with assessing the success of human beings. I mean, in a sense, there's an even broader one, which is I think we're going to have to look at probably through survey data, ongoing casework information, the experience of local authorities, and fundamentally what we're trying to get at is how successfully have these people integrated, how have they been able to pick up their lives, get themselves into the labour market, live independently. And we'll have to work through, I entirely accept this is work in progress, we'll have to work through the best way to make that assessment, because fundamentally that's the question the country, I think, expects us to ask. Have we done the right thing by these people, and are they able to live their lives?
But in terms of the purpose of this committee, we're looking at not an inconsiderable amount of public money.
Agreed.
1.7 billion.
An SNP MP said Scotland was doing more than its fair share.
Home Office stats to 13th of June 2016 shows that Scotland welcomed approximately a third of refugees arriving in the UK under the expanded Syrian Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Programme. And we can see this illustrated in figure 7 of page 28 of the NAO report. Of these 2,682 souls, around half were under 18 and half were female. My own home local authority of North Lanarkshire has welcomed 79 refugees to date and are to be commended for their achievements. Given pledges of refugee uptake need to turn into action for any targets to be met, when will the rest of the UK catch up with Scotland, and what are you doing to ensure that pledges to date are actioned?
Well, of course, pledges are very much done at a local authority level, and I echo your compliments, Mr Boswell, to the active approach that most Scottish local authorities have taken here, and the map, of course, sets that out. But I wouldn't want to describe it as a UK issue, or a Scotland, England, Wales issue. It's very much one that we deal with at local authority level, where we're trying to settle people in inappropriate areas. And it goes back to the earlier questions we've had about ensuring we're engaging the widest possible range of local authorities, and that they have the capabilities to support Syrians as the Syrian refugees as they come in. We have pledges to cover the 20,000, and so we can be confident that we will achieve the overall target, and we're seeing it through.
Talk is talk and action is action. Have you ensured time limits or targets are set to pledges, and what, if any, enforcement can you implement on a voluntary process? And secondly, are there any indications of local authorities that are reneging on pledges, or do you anticipate specific pledges that will be unfulfilled?
Well, I think actually the local authorities who are pledging are walking the walk as well as talking the talk, Mr Boswell, right the way around the country.
And he said an enforcement mechanism would not create the right dynamic. Now, knotweed has resurfaced in the Lords, or at least on the Lords' agenda paper. Peers heard more information about how the fast-growing plant is impacting on the housing market, with lenders reluctant to help people buy properties that are affected by it. Japanese knotweed was introduced into Britain in the 19th century as an ornamental plant. It's become widespread in a range of habitats, including roadsides and buildings. As it quickly spreads, it often prevents native vegetation from growing. When a Conservative peer asked about the issue, this was the minister's reply.
Local action groups, some established with DEFRA's support, continue to reduce or eradicate Japanese knotweed in several places in England. Community protection notices are starting to be used by local authorities to address the nuisance this plant causes.
I thank my noble friend for that reply. Is he aware that I first asked this question nearly 30 years ago? There's not been a great deal of progress. Is he aware that there was a man who killed his wife and committed suicide because he couldn't sell his property because of knotweed? And also, there are many people who cannot get mortgages on their houses because of knotweed.
My Lords, may I first of all acknowledge my noble friend's tenacity in seeking to deal with this brute of a plant. But on the issue of mortgages in particular, the Royal Institution of Chartered Surveyors published an information paper only last year which aims to help valuers and mortgage lenders better understand the implications of this plant for residential properties, and we anticipate this will lead to a more pragmatic approach between all parties in dealing with the plant. But I think what my noble friend has said about the tragedy is that this plant, this invasive species, is of great concern, and we need to deal with it where we can.
Is he aware of the good work that's being done in my own borough in Pendle of an organisation called the Environmental Action Group, which employs young people who might otherwise have difficulty getting jobs, trains them and does good local environmental work, and has set about a task along with the Ribble Rivers Trust to eliminate Japanese knotweed from our borough.
Since we've got experts like Baroness Sharples and Lord Greaves in the House, has the government thought of the possibility of appointing one of them as a knotweed czar to get rid of all
Well, I think that my noble friend would make an excellent czarina, but
what you could do is what Lady Roddick did, which was when she went to Nepal and noticed that all the cyclamen were stopping the water flowing, she actually bought that and turned it into paper. So if actually we could find a use for knotweed, we might then have all the Boy Scouts in the world rushing around, getting it and raising money for our local charities.
The noble lord, the minister, recently wrote to me confirming that DEFRA has a list of native species on its national eradication programme, and that Japanese knotweed is not on the list. Isn't this evidence that the government have rather given up on the whole issue of trying to eradicate it from our shores?
My Lords, I think I have to be clear. Unfortunately, this plant has been in this country since the 19th century. It is very widespread. We unfortunately from Kew sent it up to Edinburgh thinking this was some interesting plant. So the prospects of eradicating every bit of Japanese knotweed, I think, is alas not viable at the moment.
The curse of knotweed. Another Conservative MP has decided to quit the Commons following the resignation of Zach Goldsmith in Richmond in London over the issue of Heathrow Airport. The barrister Stephen Phillips is now also resigning as an MP, as he has, as he put it, irreconcilable policy differences with Theresa May. Despite being a Leave supporter, Mr Phillips argued for Parliament to have a bigger say in the Brexit process. His departure means a by-election in Lincolnshire. The writ for the contest was moved in the formal way at the start of the day.
I beg to move that Mr Speaker do issue his warrant to the Clerk of the Crown to make out a new writ for the electing of a member to serve in this present Parliament for the county constituency of Sleaford and North Hykeham in the room of Stephen James Phillips, who since his election for the said county constituency has been appointed to the office of Steward and Bailiff of Her Majesty's Manor of Northstead in the county of York.
And that by-election in Sleaford and Hykeham is likely to be on December the 8th. He's achieved plenty of success before, but at the weekend, Andy Murray went one notch further. The tennis star, this year's Wimbledon men's champion, became officially the #1 player in the world, not a position he's had before. The Commons Speaker, John Bercow, is known to be a keen follower of tennis.
I'm sure that the whole House will wish to join me in offering our warmest congratulations to Andy Murray on becoming the men's singles world #1, the first British man to do so since the inception of the ATP rankings in 1973. It is, I think, a tribute to his talent, to his big match temperament, and to his tireless endeavour over many years.
John Bercow, a #1 speaker, probably. That's it for this programme. Do join me for our next Daily Roundup. Until then, from me, Keith McDougall, goodbye.